I recently celebrated my 16th birthday, which I remember with a special and unexpected gift from my grandmother. She gave me ownership of her penthouse, an upscale apartment that stands proudly in the city center. This place is rarely visited by herself. Her grandmother prefers a secluded life in the suburbs, where nature quietly and peacefully embraces her home. But despite her rare visits, this space has always remained for me a symbol of something more than just an apartment. It was the heart of her life in the years when the city still called her with its noise and endless possibilities. The gift became a bright spot against the background of dullness and anxiety that accompanied the last year and a half of my life. It all started suddenly when one day I woke up in a house that was no longer the same as before. My father, a man whose lot has always been work, not family, left us. His departure was as sudden as his eternal preoccupation. He did not find the strength to say this to his face. Instead, I received a dry, cold message on the phone: "Be good, son." Just 2 weeks later, his parents announced their divorce, although the truth seems to have been there for a long time, just hidden under layers of unresolved problems and understatement. My father never gave me an explanation, only left me and my younger brother under the care of my mother. Their divorce went quickly and unnoticed. The laws of our state contributed to this, as if such destruction could be handled on schedule. As soon as I began to get used to this new reality, another shock suddenly arose. As if trying to forget about the past, my mother announced that she had been dating a new man for several months. His name was William. Their whirlwind romance ended in an engagement, and this news was a new milestone in a series of shocks for me. William was supposed to be my stepfather, and I couldn't handle how quickly my mother moved on. The first meeting with William took place in a cold atmosphere. He seemed distant, his interest in our family was selective. He easily found a common language with my younger brother, but with me it was different. His dislike of me was so obvious that every conversation we had turned into awkwardness and alienation. The situation worsened when his mother announced that William had got a job outside of our state and they were planning to move. She added that she plans to take my younger brother with her, leaving me to live with my grandmother. It was a painful blow for me, as I dreamed of saving my family by moving in with them. But my mother insisted that it was better for me to stay here, where I had friends and a school where everything was already settled. In fact, it turned out that it wasn't she who was against my move, William. He thought that our intense communication and my distrust of their imminent engagement did not fit into his idea of a new, serene family life. This revelation became painful and hurtful for me, especially coming from my mother, who, as I always believed, was the person who should support me in any situation. Once we were inseparable, but now there was an insurmountable wall of her decisions and my misunderstanding between us. In the end, I stayed in the penthouse, which became a kind of refuge for me, an oasis of calm in the midst of family storms. My grandmother gave me not just an apartment, but also the sense of stability that I was so desperately looking for in these turbulent times. Her support became my anchor, especially after she suffered a heart attack, which only deepened our mutual understanding. After that intimate conversation with my mother, when she tried to explain her plans to move in with William, I realized that I could no longer wait for their departure. I decided to move in with my grandmother immediately. This was my only possible step towards maintaining my own peace of mind. Although the move itself took several days, filled with organizational chores, alienation reigned in my soul. My mother tried to assure me of her love, explaining that her decisions were nothing more than a desire to find personal happiness after so many years of pain and disappointment. But despite her words, the tension between us only grew. In the last few days before my departure, we hardly spoke. Every phrase turned into barbed remarks, every pause was filled with resentment. When it was time to leave, I didn't say goodbye to her. It was too painful to realize that I was no longer an important part of her new life. The only goodbye I really thought was worth the emotional effort was with my younger brother. He was still too young to fully understand everything that was going on, but I knew that I would miss him the most. He stayed with his mother, and the thought of him growing up in a house where I was no longer present filled me with bitterness. Life with my grandmother has become for me a long-awaited island of peace and care. Her kind heart and endless love surrounded me like a warm blanket on a cold night. Unlike my distant and almost unknown paternal grandparents, She was always the person who was there, who showed sincere care. It was a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil I had been going through in recent months. Here, in her house, I found the stability that helped me digest all the changes. Of course, the road to school was a little longer now, but it was a small price to pay for the peace and love that I was experiencing now. I kept in touch with my younger brother by calling him and monitoring how he was coping with life in his new family. But I avoided direct conversations with my mother. Every time her name flashed on the screen of my phone, I felt like everything was shrinking inside, and I just closed this message or missed the call. This tacit agreement lasted until my birthday. My grandmother turned this day into a special moment. She organized a small party, inviting my closest friends and some relatives. Everything went quietly, but warmly. Grandma, using her social media connections, was able to gather everyone who was really important to me. However, the most important moment of the holiday was the announcement that she was giving me this penthouse. She explained that her lawyer would manage the property until I turned 18, but soon it would be all mine. This news, like a bright beacon, illuminated my life at a time when everything seemed dark and unpredictable. But the joy did not last long. Somehow, apparently, the news about the gift reached my mother. And soon she made an unexpected and unwanted offer. She and William offered me to be adopted by William, on the condition that I persuade my grandmother to transfer ownership of the penthouse to him. This offer seemed to me not just unwelcome, but a real betrayal. I categorically refused. My heart was filled with cold, and I told my mother that further communication was not necessary. She tried to contact me again, but I ignored her calls and messages. Later, she wrote me a letter explaining her situation in detail. She talked about the financial and emotional support William gave her after my father left. My mother described the difficulties she faced when our father practically stopped providing financial assistance, which was in stark contrast to the lifestyle we were used to before. But despite her attempts to justify her actions, this letter only deepened the gap between us. I couldn't reconcile her pursuit of happiness with the devastation it brought to our family. Her dependence on William's support, although understandable in light of their shared life after the divorce, could not bridge the gap that her decisions had created in our relationship. The mother tried to explain that William had intervened at a time when it was particularly difficult for her. With his help, she was able to rebuild a life that, according to her, would have collapsed without him. But no matter how hard I tried to accept it, it was hard for me to ignore the fact that William wasn't particularly warm to me from the very beginning. My mother attributed his distant behavior to his past relationships, when problems with children in a previous marriage led to serious disagreements and eventually to a breakup. She believed that William was traumatized by these previous failures and probably projected his fears onto our family. She assured me that leaving me in the care of my grandmother was not a rejection of me. On the contrary, she knew that I would be taken care of, that I would be safe and surrounded by attention. But, she said, it was her way of trying to ensure her happiness without putting me at risk of new family disappointments. Nevertheless, despite all her arguments, it seemed to me that she was asking me to sacrifice my own integrity in order to adapt to her new life. She tried to convince me that with the new agreement, I could join them later, and that this would allow us to be together as a family again. She also mentioned that my younger brother missed me very much, hinting that my return could fix this situation. But the longer I read her message, the more I felt manipulated. She seemed to expect me to adjust my desires to William's demands, as if my opinion on the matter was secondary. I'd been thinking about how to answer for a long time. When I finally gathered my thoughts, I made it clear that I did not intend to follow William's terms. I told my mother that her plan to move in without me was still valid, and that I was not going to persuade my grandmother to transfer ownership of the penthouse to him. The conversation with my grandmother only confirmed me in the correctness of my decision. She was categorically against the transfer of real estate to William, not trusting his motives and, in fact, protecting the family property. Her wisdom and steadfastness helped me feel supported and confident. The next morning, my mother unexpectedly showed up at our penthouse. I was at school at the time, but my grandmother immediately informed me about the visit when I returned home. My mother came to discuss an offer to transfer the property, which I had already resolutely refused. I was puzzled. Why didn't she understand my answer the first time? My decision was firm, and I made it clear in our conversation. This repeat visit seemed like another attempt at pressure, and I couldn't help but feel a growing frustration. When we spoke again, I was blunt and perhaps harsh. But given the circumstances, my disappointment seemed justified. I became more and more convinced that my mother was just trying to please her new desires, expecting me and everyone around me to adjust to her ideas about a new life. I stood my ground, firmly stating that I needed to think about my own life and future, and that I was not going to sacrifice my well-being for her convenience. When I finished speaking, she silently got up and left. Later, I discovered that she had blocked me on all communication channels, both in the digital world and in real life. This action made me lose myself in thought. Despite feeling guilty for the harshness of my words, I understood that the problem was deeper than just our quarrels. At that moment, I began to realize that perhaps I had underestimated the time and depth of my mother's relationship with William. Perhaps their affair began long before the official divorce from my father, and this discovery made me take a fresh look at all events. Although I never wanted to think about the possibility of cheating on my mother's part, some recent discussions and her attempts to justify her actions have made me doubt everything. But I was not ready to plunge into these suspicions. There was too much pain and questions at stake, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face the truth if it turned out to be worse than I could have imagined. It was especially hard because the split meant that I could no longer talk to my younger brother the way I used to. I missed him terribly. We had always been close, and now this separation was making itself felt even more strongly. Every morning, waking up in my grandmother's apartment, I felt empty, without his ringing laughter, our common games and conversations that helped us cope with any difficulties. And now, in addition to everything else, disturbing rumors about his paternity began to spread, which only increased the confusion in my soul. These gossips only added to the pain, destroying the already fragile remnant of trust in my mother, making me doubt her honesty even more. In the last few days, my grandmother and I have been trying to figure it all out. But the deeper we delved into the details, the more questions arose. Her view of my mother has changed. She used to be more restrained, tried not to interfere in my relationship with my mother, but now her wariness was growing. Grandma noticed that there might be more behind the way my mother had been behaving in recent months than I thought. This idea gradually began to penetrate into my thoughts. I was thinking of talking to my father for clarity. Maybe he can shed some light on what's going on. Although in my heart I doubted whether he would want to discuss such sensitive issues, I realized that I had no other choice. It's been 4 days since my mother last tried to get in touch. During this time, she managed to block not only me, but also my grandmother. As painful as it was, I understood that she was trying to shut us out, protecting her new life with William. Despite all this, my grandmother continued to be an unshakable support for me. She supported me sincerely and selflessly, expecting neither financial nor moral help from her mother. This dedication of hers during the years of retirement amazed me and caused deep gratitude. I knew that it was not easy for her, that she was carrying on her shoulders a burden that, it would seem, should have been on my mother. But her sacrifice was what I valued above all else. However, during this period, everything changed when my father suddenly appeared on the threshold of my grandmother's apartment. It was a surprise, and my grandmother did not tell me that she had approached him herself, fearing that I might be disappointed if he refused to come. His appearance was sudden and strangely inappropriate, but even more unexpected was his behavior. He hugged me, apologized for everything, and sat us both down to tell the truth about what was going on in his marriage with his mother. He began to talk about their relationship, which began to deteriorate long before the official divorce. It was like a lightning strike. The father admitted that he had an affair with a colleague 4 years ago, and this caused the gradual destruction of their marriage. My mother found out about the affair about a year ago and demanded that my father not disclose this information. In exchange for her silence, she received a house, full custody of her younger brother, and generous financial support. These words stunned me. I couldn't believe that all this was happening behind my back, that such important moments were hidden from me. My father tried to explain his actions, admitted mistakes, and regretted that he was too focused on work, that he was not by my side at the most important moments of my life. He wanted me to understand that he was fighting his own demons, and that his relationship with his mother was much more complicated than I could have imagined. But the most unexpected revelation was waiting for me ahead. My father said that my grandmother contacted him because she mentioned William in her message. Her concern for me was the catalyst for his arrival. It turned out that his father had known William since their student days, and this acquaintance turned out to be far from rosy. He had known him since they were in college, and even then William had feelings for my mother. My father told me how one day, on the eve of graduation, at one of the parties, William, being under the influence of alcohol, confessed his feelings to my mother. Then she rejected him because she had already been with my father, but this confession made a certain impression on her. For several weeks after that, she hid this meeting from her father, trying to sort out her feelings. But 3 weeks later, she admitted that she was confused and didn't know what to think. I could feel the tension building inside me as I prepared for this meeting with my mother. My head was full of conflicting thoughts and suspicions. My father had already revealed a lot to me that I didn't know before, but now I needed to hear her version. I couldn't believe that my mother, whom I had always considered strong and independent, could be so deeply involved in these manipulations. When I arrived at her house, unannounced, I didn't know what to expect. I imagined her confused face when she opened the door. We stood opposite each other for several seconds in painful silence, until she finally let me in. I noticed that her usual confidence seemed to be shaken, and it gave me a slight sense of control over the situation. William wasn't at home, and this was my chance to get the truth out of her, even though I knew it wouldn't be easy. By starting the conversation with a feigned apology, I was trying to weaken her defenses. I knew that if I started too aggressively, she would shut down and withdraw into herself again, as she had before. My voice was soft and my words were carefully chosen. I expressed my doubts and concerns about how quickly William appeared in our lives after her divorce, although, in fact, I knew that everything was much deeper. I was carefully groping for this topic, trying to get at least some kind of confession out of it. My mother listened, but her eyes seemed to avoid meeting mine. She didn't want to talk about it. Instead, she talked about how lucky she was to meet William at the right time. This answer was too formulaic, too artificial, as if she had prepared it in advance for all the possible questions that might arise. But I knew there was more to this shallow phrase. I knew I would have to insist. I smoothly moved on to mentioning their past, hoping that she would finally admit that they had known each other since their student days. I knew about their relationship, I knew about their short-lived relationship, about how William once confessed his love to her. It was my trump card, but I decided to save it for the right moment. However, despite my efforts, she continued to avoid frankness, as if she was trying to escape from the trap into which I was driving her. Her every word sounded more and more strained, and I could see the tension growing. Mom avoided direct confessions, preferring to talk about how fate brought her and William together again after so many years. She didn't want to admit that they had been in touch all this time. It was a game of words, and I felt that she was deliberately evading the truth. She was skilled at it, of course, but I knew I had something she didn't have: proof. My father showed me the college photos beforehand. They were together in them, she, her father, and William. These pictures were captured memories of a time when their lives were simple, without those complicated intrigues that arose later. William was with them from the very beginning, and there was no way it could have been an accident, as my mother claimed. When I finally took one of these photos out of my pocket and showed it to my mother, she froze. Her face paled, and for a moment there was something in her eyes that I couldn't immediately recognize: fear or, perhaps, regret. I held the photo in front of her, reminding her of the past she was trying so hard to hide. I was waiting for the answer, which I thought was inevitable. But even then, she didn't give me what I was waiting for. Instead, she only dryly remarked that it was a long time ago, and that everything has changed since then. Her attempt to devalue the past did not reassure me. I knew there was more to it than that. I could feel the frustration building up inside me, but I couldn't let myself snap. My mother's outright denial that she had known William before only reinforced my doubts and strengthened my confidence in my father's words. She may have realized that her initial answers were too shallow, and eventually decided to confess. The words were hard for her, but when she spoke, I felt the whole mosaic of events begin to take shape. She admitted that she never intended to tell me about her past with William. Her voice was strained, but there was something like relief in it, as if the burdens she had been carrying for so long had become too heavy. She explained that her impetuous engagement and desire to leave with him was nothing more than an attempt to forget about my father. She wanted to erase from her life everything that reminded her of him, everything that reminded her of a past that didn't work out the way she dreamed. And then came the most painful confession. She revealed the secret she was holding against my father, his affair. This very secret gave her the opportunity to conclude a more favorable divorce agreement. This was the very moment when she broke her promise to him. And it couldn't help but hurt me. I realized that despite all her desire to start a new life, she was building it on lies, manipulation, and blackmail. The conversation has lost all meaning for me. I was overcome by a cold, sharp pain of disappointment, and I saw no reason to continue it. I abruptly left, feeling her confessions coming over me in a wave. My heart was pounding, but I already had a decision inside me. I called my father, telling him that now he could act as he saw fit, because now I knew the whole truth. My father, of course, was not sinless either. His mistakes weighed heavily on our relationship, but my mother's actions put her in an even darker light. After I told my father about what happened, he insisted on a paternity test for my younger brother. Waiting for the result was stressful, but in the end, the test confirmed that he was indeed my father's son. This discovery became the starting point for the father's further actions. He has decided to seek full custody of my brother, and although the legal battles are still ahead, my opinion, as a 16-year-old, will now also be taken into account. I prefer my father to have custody, so at least there will be a chance to restore some parts of our family. In the meantime, I continue to live with my grandmother. I feel most stable with her. She has become a pillar of support for me in this chaotic time. Her unconditional love and support is the quiet corner where I can find peace amid the tearing family drama. And with my father, we are slowly starting to rebuild our relationship. He promised to be more involved in my life and is already taking steps in this direction. We are trying to find a common language, solving the accumulated problems that have been hanging between us for so long. My mother, meanwhile, was furious when she realized that my visit was not simple, but in order to reveal her secrets. She unblocked me for just enough time to express her anger by throwing a torrent of accusations at me, and then blocked me again. We haven't spoken since, and to be honest, I don't know if I'll ever want to reconnect with her again. As for William, he left my mother as soon as he proposed marriage to her. When it became clear that my father was going to challenge the financial arrangements that had been made during the divorce, William disappeared. It turned out that he had never had a real job. It was all part of the plan. He was going to use my mother's financial resources to support his uncle's business. This deception was his main motive, and now everything has fallen into place. His persistent attempts to convince me to transfer my inherited property to him were steps towards the implementation of his plan. My mother, instead of reflecting on her actions and realizing the chaos she had dragged us all into, decided to justify herself to her friends. She began to spread her version of events, and so the gossip began, which soon reached my father and me. Through these people, we learned even more details about the whole mess. Fortunately, despite all this chaos, I managed to strengthen my relationship with my father. We strive to improve them by building something new from what has been destroyed over the years. He promised to be there for me and participate in my life in a way he hadn't done before. We hope that once he gets custody, or at least joint custody of my brother, we will have a chance to become a family, even if not perfect, but perhaps happier than the one we were before.